And welcome to my Viva presentation. My name is Darren Stevens and I am a third-year PhD candidate at Coventry University. My research question was, does constructed development theory exist as a conceptual measure of self-awareness in the moment? I would like to run you through the main facets of my thesis and my thinking throughout my research journey in the next few minutes. The problem that led to my research question was this. I was working with MBA students at a London university on a program I co-created called the High Flyers, where we take a small cohort of students and develop how they think, communicate, network, and more. I started the program by profiling each student with the Identity Compass tool, and I noticed there were differences in how the profiles looked. I was researching adult development at the time as I was attending a course taught by Dr. Otto Lasky, and I wanted to know if the differences in the profiles, such as the two you see here, translated to different ways of thinking or different levels of cognitive development for the students, and thus began my PhD journey. Incidentally, the two profiles on the screen show a level 2 thinker on the left and a level 4 thinker on the right. How I approached the problem. As I was attempting to link the output of the Identity Compass with adult development, I knew this was a quantitative measure, and much of the literature on stage development comprises a positivistic paradigm. For the first 3 studies, this led me to positivism. However, we also know that the subjective experiences of people are omitted by quantitative research, and I also wanted to know how an individual experiences and constructs their world. In other words, I wanted to translate the quantitative numbers that we see in the profile output into a lived experience by each participant. For all intents and purposes, this needed to be an uncovering of how the participants saw their construction of self, including a subjective measure of their personality, so I devised studies 4 and 5. Network analysis allows for the exploration of patterns of various constructs, in this case cognitive intentions, by identifying their relationships by providing a new perspective on personality, and I wanted to know how aware the participants were of these relationships. So, from the literature review, what this research aimed to demonstrate was that intention, awareness, choice, and response were missing from the existing personality profile questionnaires and from people's construction of their thinking. What unites and separates profile tools? Although within the research there is consensus on the structural organization of personality, there is less agreement about the mechanisms responsible. In the Big Five, or Ocean, we can see that the personality dimensions, such as extroversion, are merely descriptions of summaries of many different personality characteristics. An issue arises when McRae and Costa consider the dimensions of personality as causes of the characteristics they subsume. In other words, ticking the box that states you enjoy going to parties becomes the reason you go to parties. This tautology adds to what is called psychometric isomorphism in the industry and leads to obvious epistemological inconsistencies. I needed a profile tool that measures intention and awareness, not what amounts to psychological essentialism. Also, trait-based personality profiles are poor predictors of future behavior, and in my thesis I state that I can determine how people think and behave from their thinking quotient profile. Finally, Ocean in its current form does not address vertical development, so I chose the Identity Compass. My expectations. I was hoping to shortcut the whole process and find that at each level of the thinking quotient there is a specific combination of cognitive intentions as its foundation, and these would then map beautifully and elegantly onto Keegan's levels of adult development. However, that's not necessarily how it turned out. There are many claims by psychologists on what it is to be at a certain stage of development, but these claims turn out to be simply descriptions of thinking and behaving rather than an explanation of how the individual constructs their thinking at that stage. I wanted to know if the individual at Keegan's stage 3, socialised mind, constructs their thinking differently to the individual at stage 4, self-authored mind, and if I could map both and map the difference that makes the difference using cognitive intentions. Major findings. This slide is taken from study 3, where the data were significant and supported the existence of thinking styles and the thinking quotient scale. Bottom left, you can also see the factor analysis of study 3's data. This factor analysis demonstrates how my findings support Piaget's theory of disequilibrium and Ashford's identicide, where those cognitive intentions in dimension 1 are opposed by, or kept in check by, those in dimension 3. The data also supports Dunn's claim that in order to grow, the student needs to focus on the less habituated heuristic. And lastly, it supports Vermont's similar perspective that constructive friction is a process for disrupting a student's thinking. I take this one step further in my thesis and say that disruption is the only way to grow one's complexity. The factor analysis in Study 3 supports this assertion, as do the findings of Studies 4 and 5. This graph also illustrates the reification of thinking styles. The combination of cognitive intentions at each stage of the thinking quotient is different, and thus results in a different way of constructing one's thinking from increasing degrees of awareness. The greater the thinking quotient number, the greater one's awareness of one's intention in the moment. When we focus and look at the research on the fluidity of movement between stages, it focuses on either transformation or transition. Transformation describes the radical change and qualitative difference from one stage to the next. Transition is the small incremental movement from one stage to the next higher stage. However, as has been mentioned, the transition between stages is essentially a description. So far as I could find, there is no thing to tweak in order to move someone from a socialized mind to a self-authoring mind. Also, the study of the mechanisms of stage transition have been undertaken since the early 80s. In microdevelopment, the use of bridges is advocated. However, the lack of meaning-making might suggest that those bridges are simply personal scaffolds. The bridging process from one stage to the next is still only ever described. What is omitted is the change in intention when researchers discuss stage transition. The bridge might be a change in intention due to a change in meaning-making. I made the argument in my thesis for there being no hierarchy of stages, and instead there is a continual holarchy of growth, like the rings of an onion. Also, from an essentialism perspective, calling development a stage movement has influenced the field to such an extent that developmental psychologists have been caught in a philosophical, ontological and tautological trap. By focusing on developing our habituated heuristics, the onion moves us away from the need for stages as an indicator of cognitive growth. How is this research significant? In this slide, I am effectively trying to demonstrate what separates and unites a number of psychological theories. There are a number of significant takeaways from the 5 studies in the thesis, and we have seen some already. Using constructed development theory as a gauge for cognitive intention use, either consciously or unconsciously, I have effectively mapped a bridge between how one would construct themselves in context and how they would construct their context. The recognition that this is the case amounts to someone being at the highest levels of the TQ as they understand everything is constructed, thus potentially bridging constructivism and constructionism. Also, even though I use cognitive intentions to measure dynamic intelligence, if another researcher has a different way of measuring self-awareness, then their result is still a measure of someone's dynamic intelligence. How aware someone is of their self-awareness is dynamic intelligence. Michael Commons said there is no such thing as competence. He focused on the complexity of tasks. However, if we consider thinking on the TQ scale, then the act of thinking becomes the task, and competence might be known by a different name, dynamic intelligence, thus supporting Commons' perspective. Finally, if constructed development theory is configurable into a discrete psychological field of study, then one might eventually become a constructed developmental psychologist. As per the last slide, here is the real-world application. Study 5 supports this view. Although this appears at first glance to be a hierarchical scale of complex thinking, and thus a stage perspective, it should be viewed more as a gradual increase in one's self-awareness that leads to balance and thus more choice in how one constructs themselves and their surroundings. The realization that everything is constructed increases as one walks on the path of the new theory. New numbers have been used to differentiate this from existing theories, which all use stages 2 to 5. Commons once asked me whilst at a conference, how does he know that there are only 16 levels? I said, how? He said, because I haven't reached level 17 yet. Commons illustrates that the numbers are arbitrary. What is important is an increase in intention, awareness, and choice, and the recognition that we construct everything. The further away from our habituated patterns we are able to move, the greater our control over our construction of everything. Future research. The publishers Routledge have had 3 reviewers say they like the idea for the book on the right, which would be for general consumption. However, they want to see some published materials and then a written chapter to review. I have potentially taken a job at a London-based university and will hopefully continue with my research on MBA students and extend it to undergrads. I have also got onto the DBA course, the doctoral course, delivering a workshop based on my research. I'm not 100% certain what this will be, but I'm very excited to have some impact at this level of academia. I am also aware that I need to publish the main research paper that comes from this study. That's the end of my Viva presentation. Many thanks for paying attention and listening.